Hey, welcome back to my series on uncommon Tailwind CSS. So in this one, we're going to talk about dry Tailwind CSS. You may or may not be familiar with the term dry. It stands for don't repeat yourself, DRY. Dry applies to all types of programming and all types of coding. Don't repeat yourself. It's about making sure that you're not rewriting the same code over and over again. And if you're familiar with Tailwind CSS at all and you're using utility classes, then when you are writing Tailwind CSS, you start to repeat yourself a whole lot, right? So let's see this in action, and let's see some of the ways that we can deal with this and some of the ways that I prefer to avoid repeating myself when I'm designing and building a lot of stuff using Tailwind CSS. Here's a little example project I've got going. This is in a Rails, Ruby on Rails app, and I designed a little card, right? It's got sort of a light blue background, headline, description, some bullet items, and a button. And here's the markup for that. And as you can see, I just put in the Tailwind CSS classes around the container, and then I've got a few on the H2 headline here, the small description, the unordered list with a couple of bullet items, and then we've got a button. This is a link with some classes that make it look like this button. As you can see, it's just a straightforward element. We're not really repeating ourselves a whole lot because we're only seeing these items, one at a time. But what happens if we want to repeat this card? So, for example, let's make like a little grid, something like that. We'll wrap it. And then we're going to repeat it so that we have, let's say, 4 cards. Okay, so now we have 4 instances of this card, right? And we can use our text editor to collapse these down if we want to, and that starts to make it a little bit more manageable, but we're still repeating ourselves a whole lot here, not just the containing classes, but if we open this up, every time we have an H2, we're using that same set of classes. So if we wanted to, change the color of the H2 in these cards to something like our secondary color, I can change it there. But as you can see, that only changed it for the first one. I would have to repeat that same change to all of them, right? So I would have to go down, and yeah, the AI can help me find each of these, and I can just tab and add it. But I'm not going to, can always rely on on AI here to catch all these mistakes and make it. AI auto completion is not a replacement for dry programming. We still want to make sure that our code is dry so that we can manage each style, each component, each thing in one place without having to change it in multiple places. That's the whole idea behind dry programming. So how can we deal with this? There's a few different approaches that we can take. I'm going to talk through a few of them, and then I'll give you my preferred approach. You might be familiar with extracting styles out to components in Tailwind CSS. Now, that is one option, and that might be your first option if you're just learning Tailwind CSS. So you can do something like this. Let's take these styles and we'll replace it. So I'm pulling in a separate style sheet, and I'm putting it inside the layer components, and I'm going to create a new class called card, and we'll use the apply, and we'll paste our styles for the container of the card to go there instead of here. So we can replace that with our class card. And I'm going to do that in all 4 spots. And I just need to refresh my styles here. Okay, so it still looks the same, and that was helpful in that now we can control the back or the containing styles in one place instead of 4 places, right? So if we wanted to change this to orange, we can change that in one place. But we still have a lot of other repeating code in here, like the code that controls these H2s, right? So to do something like this. and the P tags as well, right? So we can start to eliminate some of those styles. And okay, so we're starting to reduce the amount of classes that we have to put into the markup because we have extracted them out to this component in Tailwind. Now, I'm going to stop right here because this is not my preferred approach. And as you can see, what I'm starting to do here is sort of write traditional CSS. And this is just going to keep growing because inevitably I would have to keep creating additional CSS styles using the apply rule for the bullet lists and the button inside of a card. And, we're nesting styles. And of course, we can make use of things like Sass that could start to help. But then we're going to run into all the same problems with traditional CSS because every time, we need to refactor this or use it in different ways, we're going to need to come into this separate CSS style and refactor all of our CSS. And, what happens if we have a big card and a small card and a blue card and an author card or a product card or all these different things? We're going to then want to change, create different versions of the same component. It's just going to be a mess. We're trying to avoid all that. That's why we use Tailwind CSS in the first place, is to avoid having to build out and maintain all of these big, complex CSS files, right? So let's get rid of all this stuff and find another way to handle this dry problem, right? I'm going to wipe all that out. We're going to revert back to our non-dry code here. Okay. So since I'm working in Ruby on Rails, and you might be working in Rails or another framework that offers the ability to have partials, this is my go-to option here, is to create partials early and often. Because as soon as I start building something that I think is going to be repeatable, and I'm going to want to use it in multiple places, that's a perfect opportunity to create a partial. So in Rails, I'm going to create a partial like this. I'm going to put it in the shared folder here inside my views, and I'm going to create a partial called card, html.erb. So the first thing is I'm going to pull out the first card, and I'm going to drop that in here. And so now I'm going to replace that with this render line, shared card. And I can repeat that 4 times. Okay, so now our HTML is much cleaner. And as you can see here, nothing has actually changed. We're still pulling in 4 instances of the card. But of course, the content in all of these is different. We're going to need to make that content dynamic. So let's start with the titles of the cards. We're going to need to be dynamic. We can do something like this. I like to sort of organize it this way. I'm a card title. And over here, we will replace that with local assigns title. Now, the other ones don't have a title yet, right? So we have to add a title to each of these. And as you can see, they can be different on each one. We'll do the same for a description, button text, and button URL. And I'm going to come back to the bullets in just a second. Okay, so what did I just do? In our HTML file, we have the card partial, and we're passing in local variables for the title, description, button text, and button URL. Now, each time we use one of these cards, we might have different numbers of bullets, right? So in that case, since the content is going to be sort of like variable, I like to make these a block. So I'm going to add a do here, and we will take out these 3 bullet list items and drop them in here. And then we're going to replace those with yield. So we're going to yield the content just like that. Now, as you can see, we are yielding the content for the first one, but we're not yet yielding it for the second, third, and fourth. So we would have to do the same thing down here. Now let's pause and take a look at what's happening here. Now, as you can see, this Rails partial is starting to get a little bit complex. We've got a lot of options here. But when it comes to Tailwind CSS, we are not repeating ourselves because we're only managing the Tailwind CSS classes in this one partial. And that was the whole goal here, that was to make sure that we're only managing the styles in one place. We're not repeating ourselves. So that's good. So I just talked about partials. Again, they're smaller code files. They're easier to read and easier to maintain in one place. Now, let's talk about variables. This is another good option that you'll come across quite a bit, because a lot of times, a partial might be overkill, or sometimes you've got like nested partials, which sometimes are necessary, but sometimes it's just too much, right? So here's something else. What if I wanted to add some styling to these individual list items, right? If I wanted to do something like this, and let's make it medium and italic, right? Okay, so I just added styling to that first bullet point, but since that's a list item, we're going to need to apply it to each of the list items, right? Now, here we go again. We're repeating ourselves. We're seeing the same set of CSS classes applied to multiple elements in our page here. Now, what we could do is create another nested partial just for each list item. And sometimes we get to that point. But in this case, it's a little bit of a smaller spot where I want to do this. So sometimes I set a simple Ruby variable right here in the page, something like this, list item classes, and I'll just pop them in there. And then I can just replace those with the variable. I sort of like to do that. Oops. Oh. So, it accomplishes the same goal, but again, I'm reducing the number of repetitions. I'm only defining these styles in one place, and then I'm applying that class name in these spots. Now, of course, I would have to sort of repeat the same thing on the other ones, but I just wanted to give you a simple example of when I might reach for a simple variable instead of pulling out to an entire partial. There's one more tip that I want to give you, and I do this all the time in my UI components that I build in Rails, and that is I combine partials and variables. So we now have this partial for card, right? And I'm using it in 4 different places, but sometimes one instance of a card is like slightly different from the next, and it's not just the content, which we can control in the local variables or in the content that we're yielding, but sometimes we have slight style variations. Now, let's say I want to have one version of the card that has like an orange background. I'm not going to duplicate the card partial and have one called like blue card and orange card, right? Because then again, we're getting into repeating ourselves. So instead, I'm going to actually use additional local variables to set some of the actual styles in the card. And this is one of the really big benefits of using Tailwind CSS in conjunction with a framework like Ruby on Rails. And the same would apply to most other frameworks like Laravel or other things. So I'm going to go into my card partial, and I want to, we can do something simple like this where we could just totally override all of the classes. So I might do something like this. So I can define card classes right there. And what I'm doing is if I pass it custom classes, then we'll use those. And if those are not present, then we'll fall back to our default classes. So I can then do this. But in this case, I would need to actually copy those defaults and then change them as needed. And I'm going to show you a better way in just a second, but just to show you what I'm doing, and I know it's erroring out on me over there. Let's fix that. Here in this case, on the first one, I'm passing in custom classes, which is mostly the same. So the space Y is the same, the padding is the same, the rounded is the same, but I'm just giving it a different background orange, right? So in this case, it's getting to this partial, and instead of defaulting card classes is present, so it's going to use that instead, and it's going to put those classes right here. But in the rest of these card instances, card classes is not present, right? So down here, we're not defining card classes, so that's why we default back to the blue. Now, I said I don't really like this approach because it's still too broad, and it still requires me to repeat these additional classes. So what I prefer to do in this case is make the options that I pass to the card much, much more specific. So instead of just card classes, I'm going to put these back here for a second. I'm going to say background class. You know what? I'll actually say BG color. And the default there will be blue. And we're only going to replace that specific class with BG color. And then I might do the same for padding, card padding, maybe card spacing, and card rounded. And then I like to sort of make these nice and readable for me like that. Okay, so now I have like a totally configurable card. But as you can see, I can start to really modify each individual instance of the class. So we're going to do that. And let's say in the second one, I want to just give it different padding, right? As you can see, this one has a little bit more padding than the other ones. And let's say this third one, we're going to change the card rounding. In that case, we're going to set it to nothing. Let's make it small. You can see it's a little bit tighter there. So that wraps up the tips that I have on making sure that your Tailwind CSS is as dry as possible. Again, that's don't repeat yourself. It's something that I use all the time. I use a lot of partials, and I always try to extract my classes out to their own variables. And only as a last resort, I'll actually use Tailwind's extracting capabilities. And that's going to be actually my other video. One of my next ones coming up here is when to actually extract Tailwind CSS classes using that apply directive when you're writing out your CSS files. There are a few cases where I do think that makes sense, and I'm going to talk about those in the next video. Thanks for watching.